There. Now, sorry, I was muted. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So I work on infratemporal cortex, which is that part of the primate brain responsible for our ability to recognize objects. We know this because people who have lesions or strokes in IT can have problems in recognizing objects. And we know from neurology and functional imaging that humans and monkeys have domains in temporal cortex dedicated to processing faces, places, bodies, and tools, and humans have text domains. There is a dispute. So this is a part of the brain that normally isn't considered even retinotopic or map-based, but I hope I'll convince you that otherwise. There's a dispute in the field of face and object processing over whether these specialized domains in ventral cortex are genetically predetermined or sculpted by experience. These domains could be innate, given that we have domains for biologically important things like faces and bodies. And most importantly, these domains are all in stereotype locations from one human to the next or one monkey to the next. But experience has to play a role in domain formation, given that we have domains for unnatural things like buildings and text. We have a lot of early experience with text and with faces. So to look at the role of experience in domain formation, we taught a bunch of young monkeys to recognize and discriminate human symbols. And when we scanned them with functional imaging, we found that they developed domains selectively responsive to these trained symbols. This means that experience is sufficient for domain formation. But we sort of already knew that from the fact that humans have text domains. There are multiple theories out there as to how these domains form. To try to disentangle the effects of experience, age of learning, and functionality, we taught a bunch of young monkeys to recognize 3 distinct sets of symbols. And we taught these different symbol sets in different orders in different monkeys. And to our surprise, training order didn't matter. The level of expertise didn't matter. Each symbol set developed a domain in a stereotyped location. These fixed locations for intensively experienced unnatural stimuli indicated to us that experience, that is neuronal activity, must be sorting inputs on some kind of proto-map. We looked at the development of face domains in baby monkeys, and early in development, we didn't see any face domains. And we found in monkeys that face domains appear around 200 days of age, and the selectivity is stable after that. So our work suggests that experience acts on some kind of proto-organization to cause the formation of domains. But the innatist camp came right back at us and said, the domains are really there, they just need to mature. So to distinguish between these two ideas, we asked what happens if you block a particular experience early in development. We raised baby monkeys while we wore welder's masks, and we didn't let them see other monkeys. So in control monkeys, you have face domains, and face-deprived monkeys had no face domains. So it could be that their entire temporal lobe was messed up by the abnormal rearing conditions. So we showed them images of things that they saw a lot of, like hands, human hands, monkey hands, familiar objects. So control monkeys have face domains, and adjacent to that, hand domains. Face-deprived monkeys have no face domains, but they do have hand domains, if anything, stronger hand domains than control animals, and they have normal body and scene domains. So experience must be necessary for domain formation. It's both sufficient and necessary. So what kind of proto-architecture might be present in baby monkeys? In adult monkeys, retinotopic maps of visual space are found throughout the entire visual system, even in regions that textbooks often refer to as non-retinotopic. In adult monkeys and humans, there are multiple mirror image polar angle maps throughout all of visually responsive cortex. And eccentricity. There's a foveal confluence. This is the fovea, central visual field, projecting anteriorly, flanked on either side by more peripheral upper and lower visual fields. To get these retinotopic maps in a monkey, you need to have the monkey fixate, which requires training, and newborn monkeys aren't going to do that. So Michael Arcaro analyzed patterns of spontaneous functional MRI activity across visual cortex. In fMRI, pairs of voxels that are anatomically connected fluctuate together, so you can infer connectivity by correlations in the fMRI signal. V1 is organized retinotopically before birth. So by seeding different parts of V1, Mike found a large-scale map of eccentricity throughout the entire visual system in newborn monkeys. These maps are virtually identical to the large-scale organization measured in adult monkeys and in these same monkeys when they grew older. So you start with a map, and experience must sculpt that map into functional domains. But how do you get the stereotype location for each of these functional domains? Well, there are two features of category domains that might be involved. Face domains are always located in central visual field parts of IT and scene domains in peripheral parts. And face domains respond better to curvy things like balls and clocks, and scene domains to rectilinear things. So we mapped eccentricity and curvature in monkeys and confirmed that face domains responded better to curvy than to straight stimuli, and to central stimuli better than peripheral stimuli. But when we looked at the entire visual system, there was a huge correlation between curvy and central visual field and rectilinear and peripheral visual field. We were surprised by this strong correlation because nobody had ever reported it before, but it turns out that a lot of previous studies just mask off early visual areas. The correlation between eccentricity and curvature is much larger scale than the category organization, covers the entire visual system. Therefore, it must be more fundamental than the correlation between category and either curvature or eccentricity. Xiaomin Yue and Leslie Ungerleider's lab recently found the same thing in humans in maps from 4 different humans here. Red is curvy selective and blue rectilinear, and curvy maps to central visual field and rectilinear to peripheral, all the way back to V1, as in monkeys, covering pretty much the entire visual system. In primates, acuity varies with eccentricity, and receptive field size varies with eccentricity. Huell and Wiesel found a lot of cells that were selective not only to orientation, but also to contour length. These end-stop cells respond to short, but not long contours, and they respond to corners, but not long edges. David Hubel and I found a lot of end-stop cells in monkey V2, maybe even more end-stop cells in V2 than in V1. And we suggested that end-stop cells would be responsive to curve contours as well as corners. So the optimum degree of curvature for end-stop cells will vary with eccentricity, with central visual field preferring high curvature and peripheral straighter contours. The fact that our study and the human mapping study both found such a strong correlation between curvature and eccentricity means that end-stopping must be pretty prevalent. But I don't think of it as just end-stopping or curvature or retinotopy, because at every stage in the visual hierarchy, inputs are combined to generate more complex receptive field properties. And this idea that the entire visual system, including IT, is map-based is at odds with the dominant view in our field, driven largely from fMRI studies, that the object recognition pathway is just divided up into these discrete modules. This view is so dominant that that's what you find in Wikipedia. An emerging view, however, is that these domains, these so-called discrete domains, are embedded in a large-scale gradient of shape selectivity, which would be consistent with it arising from an innate map of visual space. And indeed, the discreteness of these domains may be illusory, because in fMRI, the baseline is so high that you always have to subtract conditions to see anything. And almost nobody ever publishes single condition maps, but Konkel and Oliva did. And you can see that the standard technique of subtracting can lead to an illusory discreteness. Evidence is amassing that the organization of temporal cortex may be a map-based gradient, with each category merely part of a larger shape gradient in both humans in this study, and 2 studies in macaques have both shown evidence for a graded shape map in IT, and both indicating that face, body, and scene domains are just part of this graded shape map. So a retinotopic map automatically gives you a low-level shape map, which could bias that part of IT to be selective to faces, which are made up of a lot of curvy contours. But where on the map you tend to look at things could also bias the development of categories. All monkeys like to look at contours, and they love to look at small, round, dark things. Control monkeys look mostly at faces, so these are control monkeys looking at the faces in these images. Face-deprived monkeys look at hands. So control monkeys have face domains, and control monkeys look at faces. Deprived monkeys lack face domains, and they do not look at faces. So do domains cause looking behavior, or does looking behavior contribute to domain formation? So control monkeys look more at faces, which are the solid symbols, than to hands. So here's where domains appear during development. They look more at faces than at hands long before the face domains appeared. So face looking behavior precedes domain formation. Is face looking innate? Even early in development, the face-deprived monkeys looked more at hands, which is the open symbols, than at faces. Therefore, face looking can't be innate, or the face-deprived monkeys would have looked at faces. Yet, there's a huge literature showing that newborn humans and monkeys will track faces. This is usually done by asking how far an infant will track a moving schematic face. But there's some evidence that what infants track are small, round, dark things, especially in the upper visual field. And the part of our brain that makes us track small, moving, dark things, especially in the upper visual field, is our evolutionarily old superior colliculus. And the upper field bias may reflect the even older bias for looking at the upper visual field. I suspect that early infant face looking may be driven by the superior colliculus, not by face domains in IT cortex. So you start with a map. Experience of the environment acts on that map, biased by a map-based shape gradient and by looking behavior. And I suggest the same kinds of activity-dependent sorting mechanisms that are thought to generate the stripes and domains in early visual cortex and other primary sensory cortices. Can we possibly attribute the large domains in IT to the same mechanisms that form the much smaller domains in V1? Shaheen Nasser and Roger Tutel's lab mapped ocular dominance in human V1 and color and disparity domains in extrastriate cortex. These domains get increasingly coarse going up the visual hierarchy, maybe just due to input convergence at each stage and therefore broader correlation patterns. If so, huge domains by the same mechanisms would not be too surprising in IT. So I'm proposing that these self-organizing mechanisms acting on a map are universal. How universal? Well, here's the map of visual eccentricity in a newborn monkey. And here's a body map encompassing both somatosensory and motor cortices in a baby monkey. You can even see finger maps, which indicate that the body map is actually multiple, probably mirror image maps of the bodies, just like the multiple mirror image visual maps. And if you combine them, plus the fact that this bit right here comprises multiple auditory tonotopic maps, then more than half the newborn monkey brain consists of maps of the sensory periphery. That's pretty universal. So you start with a map set up by gradients of trophic molecules. Prenatally, that map is refined and clustered by spontaneous activity. Postnatally, the same neurons get driven by the environment, and now the same sorting rules generate functional clusters based on what the animals experience, including faces. Our recordings from face cells also demonstrate that even face selectivity must be experience dependent. Here's 2,550 images rank ordered by how one face cell responded to all these images. All the top images, if I blow this up, are faces. Here's another cell in the same face patch, and we've seen many cells like this. Its top ranking images are people wearing PPE. It's what we wear in the monkey room. There's no way a monkey could have evolved selectivity for people wearing PPE. PPE selectivity has to reflect this animal's individual experience. We find neurons with selectivities for PPE, for the food bin in the monkey room, and even for the colors of the collars worn by other monkeys, all of which we think is evidence that experience has sculpted neuronal selectivity. But over the last few years, there have been a huge number of fMRI studies on blind human subjects who are presented with tactile or auditory stimuli that result in category selective activations localized to similar parts of ventral temporal cortex as in sighted subjects. And all these studies have been presented by the innatist camp as evidence that domains in temporal cortex must be innate because they cross modalities. The innatist interpretation of these results is that higher areas that are innately specialized for higher functions like socialization or language feed back to drive the specialization of temporal lobe domains. Ordinarily, IT gets mostly visual input. It's not multimodal. Early auditory and somatosensory cortices project to different cortical areas. It's only when you get way past early areas in the hierarchy that you get multimodal sensory integration. So that's why these multimodal results in blind subjects have led to the conclusion that top-down influences must be required. But I think it's illogical that innate high-level areas determine functional domains in temporal cortex. I have trouble both with the idea that there are these innate high-level functions and with the idea that it's feedback from these innate areas that cause functional domains in temporal cortex. First, because higher areas evolved later than early areas, so this idea just seems backwards. Also, in both mice and in monkeys, during development, feed-forward inputs are wired up before feedback inputs. In order to explain all these blind subject studies that have been interpreted as proving the innateness of high-level organizations, I want to invoke MAPS, a global organization of maps in cortex. In somatosensory and motor cortex, upwards on the body is ventral in cortex, and down on the body is dorsal. This is also true in visual cortex. Up in the visual field is ventral, and down in the visual field is dorsal. Indeed, the same trophic factors, efferents, set up the gradients for different sensory modality maps. If you look at the visual and body maps on the monkey brain, although there are multiple maps and they go around corners, largely down in the world is dorsal in the cortex and up in the world is ventral. And we found that these maps are present at birth. Half the baby monkey cortex is maps of the sensory periphery. These global maps are aligned posteriorly, and major connectivity is also along the AP direction. And I think global map alignment and correlated topographies could explain these otherwise surprising cross-modal commonalities seen in blind subjects. For example, peripheral parts of the visual maps, which are correlated with scene processing, are aligned with parietal cortex, which is involved in navigation. Faces are represented centrally, aligned with low-frequency tonotopy, where vocalizations are represented, and continuing anteriorly with face-selective somatotopy. So topographic connectivity could explain both auditory and tactile specificity in these blind subjects. I think these principles are universal among mammals. Different sensory maps are aligned according to the parts of the world they represent and interconnected so that, unlike us, many mammals already at birth integrate information about the same parts of the world across visual, motor, somatosensory, and auditory modalities. And I think we inherited that alignment and interconnectivity, and that's what's being revealed by these blind studies. Given that we evolved from animals without higher cognitive areas, it seems to me we ought to be looking for bottom-up, map-based explanations rather than invoking top-down innate functions. And now I'd like to speculate that not only are higher areas not responsible for driving category segregation in temporal cortex, I want to speculate that higher functions are also wired up according to these same universal map-based activity-dependent sorting mechanisms. First, higher areas also show topographic connectivity. In this functional connectivity study from Randy Buckner's lab, a seed moving around in frontal cortex, this is the seed, as it moves around in frontal cortex, you can see the systematic shift of connectivity throughout the brain. That's topographic connectivity. Recently, Chu et al. And Bob Desimone's lab showed that monkey lateral prefrontal cortex is topographically interconnected with a bunch of other higher cortical areas. This connectivity does not extend back down to sensory cortices, but we already saw that sensory cortex maps onto some of these areas like temporal and parietal cortex. So by transitivity, this result indicates that probably the entire neocortex is topographically interconnected. So I think these blind subject studies are not showing innateness. Instead, I think they're tantalizingly showing universal principles of how different sensory modalities and even higher brain areas are aligned and interconnected. So it turns out, I was surprised to discover that linguists are interested in our work, showing that face patches are not innate. And I thought this was odd because, monkeys don't even talk, right? But it turns out there's a similar dispute in linguistics with a strong innatist camp, also centered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, originating with Noam Chomsky. And his theory about the innateness of language is being challenged by a number of linguists. So in the 60s, Chomsky famously proposed that humans must have an innate language module because of how easily children learn language and the fact that they can utter novel grammatical sentences that they've never heard before. And he asserted that all human languages share arbitrary grammatical features that represent only a fraction of all possible grammars. And it turns out there are a lot of linguists who disagree, and they say that none of the universal grammar features are true of all human languages, and the apparent universalities can be explained by phonology, logic, semiotics, and memory. Further, they propose that it's languages that evolved to be easy to learn by the architecture of the human brain. And although nobody proposes this, I'd also argue that the apparent specialization of the stereotype parts of the adult brain for language arises by activity-dependent plasticity from experiencing languages, just like if you learn to read, you develop a text domain, and if you don't learn to read, you don't have one. And given how recently literacy has been prevalent, nobody argues that the text domain evolved. It has to be learned. So here's another problem with the idea that a language module evolved as a language-specific module. Language appeared as humans migrated out of Africa. If a language module evolved, why did these genes emerge suddenly and then stop evolving? Evolution continued during these migrations since humans exhibit physical features that fit their geographic environment, like skin pigmentation, eyelids, noses appropriate to the climate, lactose tolerance in cultures that domesticated milk-producing animals. If language genes adapted to local linguistic environments, we should expect different biologically encoded universal grammars, each adapted to its local linguistic context. But there's apparently no genetic bias for one's own linguistic genetic lineage. So lastly, I'd like to speculate that even language, a high-level human-specific function, may develop according to map-based principles. Jack Gallant's lab just published a study where they showed silent videos and read stories to human subjects. They mapped the parts of the brain responsive to what they saw in the silent videos in red and what they heard in the stories in blue. If they sorted the responses by the category of what the subject saw or heard, you can see the people stuff here in central visual field with the scene stuff flanking. consistent with people face selectivity in central visual field and seen stuff more peripherally. If we look just at this region and map the visual versus the linguistics and draw a green line along the border, you can see that the category specificity extends across the border. So that border is where high-level vision and high-level auditory maps converge. And you can see that the category specificity extends across the border. The people stuff is in the same AP extension of central visual field in vision and language, flanked by seen stuff. So I love the idea that even higher functions may also develop according to map-based activity-dependent sorting mechanisms. But I do hate the idea that this idea is so contentious. And that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Margaret. That's a beautiful talk. We are happy to learn the development of those specialized modules. Any questions from here? Okay, I saw one question from the audience. So you can see it in the chat, but I will read for the audience if you don't mind. So you focus on maps that follow the spatial structure of the peripheral sensory organ, the retina, skin, musculature, and cochlea. Recent human fMRI results show topographic mapping by other features like numerosity, object size, and even timing. So do you think there may be topographic organization within object selective cortex that follows unknown object properties, not just retinotopy?
Probably, but I bet retinotopy plays a role in setting it up. So of course the whole thing gets modified by learning. But if you look within, for example, face selective cortex, eyes are mapped above in the visual field to where mouths are, and heads are mapped above bodies. So I think it probably relates to an original map-based topography. That's my bias.
I would like to take the chance also ask one question. So I saw that during talk you mentioned the experience versus the innate or predetermined genetic underpinnings of those development of those modules. So and you have used experience deprived monkeys, so deprived them of certain experience such as seeing faces. So recently there has been technological advances that we can actually manipulate genes in the monkeys. Or I know it's still challenging, but maybe in the future we have ways to manipulate as you wish certain circuits and then their activities. So do you see in the future any such lines of investigation meaningful or has any potential? Thank you.
Oh, I would love. So I don't understand. All these maps are, first there's a primary cortex, and then there are these mirror image maps all the way up, multiple. I want to know how those form. And I'll bet somebody with the ability to manipulate genes can figure that out. I'd love to know the answer to that.
Thank you. Do you have time for another question? Okay, so I saw one question that is, face blindness is a condition for some people. Is it likely that the activity of such people is altered in the face recognition region of the brain?
Oh, that's disputed by all these human fMRI people, but I bet it's going to boil down to they didn't look at faces the same way when they were little. But that's just my bet. That's a human question.
Thank you. Due to the constraints of time, we can move on to the next speaker. Thank you, Margaret.